What is up, Trailblazers? Welcome back to my channel if you've been here before, and for today's guide we're going to be covering Kafka. In today's guide we'll be covering kit, including traces and Eidolons, we'll be covering build options, including light cones and her best relic sets, and finally we'll be doing some comments on her best team options and synergies. I will jump straight into it because Kafka is a very complex unit and she does require some explanation and breakdown. So let's start with Kafka's kit. Kafka is a 5-star nihility character that specializes in increasing damage to enemies by capitalizing on damage over time effects or DoTs already applied to those enemies. She's also very capable of applying a shock DoT to the enemies herself for detonation. Starting with Kafka's skill, Caressing Moonlight, Kafka will deal lightning damage on an 80 to 160% scaling of her attack to a target enemy with a cleave effect of attack percent scaling damage hitting adjacent enemies. If the enemy is receiving DoTs, then all DoTs currently placed on the enemy will produce damage equal to 60 to 75% of their original damage, scaling with level. This skill can be a very powerful damage dealer if you've got a mix of DoTs on the enemy, such as a sampo stacked wind shear, so it creates a viability for bringing more than one DoT character to the fray. Her ultimate Twilight Trill deals lightning damage, scaling with Kafka's attack to all enemies. There's a 100% base chance for enemies hit to become shocked and take damage from their current shock state equal to 80 to 100% of its original damage. Additionally, while shocked, enemies will receive lightning DoT equal to 115 to 290% of Kafka's attack scaling with level at the beginning of each turn. Kafka's Talon, Gentle but Cruel. After an ally of Kafka uses a basic attack on an enemy target, she will immediately launch a follow-up attack and deal lightning damage equal to 42 to 140% of her attack to that target, with a 100% base chance to inflict shock equivalent to that applied by her ultimate to the attacked enemy target for 2 turns. This effect can only be triggered once per turn though, so you have to be cautious if you're using someone like Luka who can do multiple basic attacks in one turn. It's not going to create a cycle of applying these follow-up shocks. Finally, Kafka's technique, Mercy is Not Forgiveness. It's a battle instigating technique that will deal lightning damage scaling with Kafka's attack and has a 100% base chance to apply shock in the same way her ultimate does too. Kafka scales very well with having DoTs on the enemy, so sometimes it can be very worthwhile just starting the battle with a shock already applied to your enemy. For Kafka's traces, her A2 Torture, when her ultimate is used, enemy targets will now receive damage immediately from all currently applied DoT sources. This will include damage from both break and normal DoTs. Her A4 Plunder will give Kafka 5 energy when an enemy is defeated while shocked, and her A6 Thorns will change the base chance for the ultimate technique or follow-up attack triggered by her talent to inflict shock by another 30%. While 30% doesn't sound like a lot, it does actually bring down her effect hit rate requirements at E0 down to a reasonable 29%. This 29% becomes more achievable when you factor in her minor traces, which give an 18% effect hit rate, a 28% increase to her attack, and 10% in HP, all of which can be very viable for her damage output and some generic tankiness. Before doing a kit summary, I do like to do an Eidolon run through, and I will stress that at base, Kafka is very good. Her Eidolons do give some significant increases to her damage output, especially at E2 and E6, so let's round those off very quickly. Kafka's E1 Da Capo. When the talent triggers a follow-up attack, there is a 100% base chance to increase the DoT received by the target by 30% for 2 turns. It can be stressed that the E1 does not benefit from her A6 trace, and so if you want to reliably utilize the E1 effect, you will need to adjust your effect hit rate accordingly. Her E2 Fortissimo. While Kafka is on the field, DoT dealt by all allies increases by 25%. Her E2 is a great Eidolon as it's going to make DoT teams that bit more effective. DoT characters right now all have very high attack and attack percent mods in their kits, and so they value external sources of damage increase. With Sampo and Luka's ultimate offering one form of each of doing that, Kafka's E2 gives a nice rounding off effect. Kafka's E3 is the usual +3 to scale and +1 to basic attack, with the E5 pulling her to a +2 to her ultimate and a +2 to her talent. Her E4 Recitativo, when an enemy target takes damage from the shock status inflicted by Kafka, Kafka additionally regenerates 2 energy. While 2 energy doesn't sound like a lot, there are theory crafted guides providing that it can net you up to an ultimate every 2 turns when combined with an ERR percent rope. And finally her E6 Legiro. The shock inflicted on the enemy target by her ultimate, her technique, or the talent triggered follow-up attack now has a damage modifier increase of 156% and lasts 1 turn. This is an increase, so you can take your 290% ult and add 156% to that. Now, would I recommend pulling for any specific 5-star characters Eidolons? No, not unless you heavily wanted to invest in them. Fortunately with Kafka, her Eidolons rise with value, meaning that her E1 and E2 are safe places to stop, and of course you can find value if you have planned to invest in her and you want to pull all the way up to E6. One thing of note is that her E4 does synergize well with her signature light cone, making Kafka the prime opportunity candidate for max investment. For an overall character kit summary, it's fair to point out that most of Kafka's kit is dependent on the DoTs being applied to an enemy. While if Kafka does have an ability to apply shock, she would greatly benefit from other sources of DoT so that when she triggers her skill, she can get multiple detonations. Your standout DoT applicators are going to be the characters that are built for it, such as Sampo and Luka. However, and this is a very important however, this doesn't mean that Kafka can't find some very great synergy opportunities with break effect DoT characters like Asta, Xushang and Himeko. The overall damage will be lower, but it is there. Given that Kafka can apply a DoT without break, but can also very easily pull in a ton of value from existing DoTs already on the enemy, this makes her a potential permanent stay character in your roster even when new characters are added. While I can't see into the future, I would argue that her baseline kit for the generic DoT playstyle will be relevant for a very long time to come, simply because she's at the core centerpiece of what your other DoT characters want to be doing. With her kit covered, I'd like to move on to build options, start with light cones, and then we'll go into relics. For light cones, I'd like to start with a free-to-play option and work my way up. If you're really struggling for a light cone option, I would recommend starting with investing into Fermata. It's a 4-star free-to-play option available in the Forgotten Hall, making it a very easy option to get to Super in Position 5. At max investment, you're getting 476 base attack, and you're going to increase the damage dealt to enemies inflicted with shock or wind shear by 32%, making it a great DPS pickup for Kafka that is free and reduces a barrier of entry to using her. For other 4-star options worth considering, she does get a lot of value out of the 4-star Eyes of Prey. You'll get a very strong damage percent multiplier for your DoTs, but it is worth taking off that the effect hit rate can be somewhat overkill on Kafka at E0. There is also Good Night Sleep Well, which is a very significant 4-star light cone for Kafka. You have a stacking percent damage increase for the wearer per debuff/DoT on the enemy. At base it's at 12%, but at Super in Position 5 this becomes a stacking 24% mod, leading up to 72% damage increase, giving you a crazy jump in power. For 5-star options, you do have Welt's signature light cone. The effect hit rate does have more value on an E1 Kafka or a Kafka with Pangalactic Planar Ornament, and the attack percent increase of 24% surprisingly does well with Kafka's kit because of DoT damage scaling with attack and her DoT partners such as Sampo and Luka doing damage and DoT debuffs in the ultimate that just complement the way that this light cone is built. Finally, her signature one, which people will be drawing you to. Patience is all you need, and it's one of her best light cones. It is a stunning light cone option with a 24% damage buff and a speed buff at 14% at base that has to stack to get there. Now, the Erode passive is a very strong ability when you factor in that the light cone trigger is per hit and not per action, meaning that she can execute the passive on multiple times per turn with abilities like her skill that hit multiple times. In damage, it is the top premier DPS option, but it's not necessary for her to perform well. It is also worth clearing up that a lot of people compare her signature with Good Night Sleep Well on an S1 5-star to an S5 4-star basis. I always find this to be a little bit of an unfair comparison because Good Night Sleep Well is a gacha light cone and you'd only have multiple copies of this if you pulled on the Sele or Lawocha light cone banners. While calculations do show a Good Night Sleep Well at Super in Position 5 being very close to the damage of an S1 Patience is All You Need, it is critical to remember that Patience is All You Need will also give you some flexibility in speed breakpoints for those who are min-maxing Kafka, and if you do not have access to Good Night Sleep Well, it doesn't mean that you're missing out too much because both Fermata and Welt's signature are purchasable. With light cones covered, let's talk relics. For relic stats, we're going to want Kafka to prioritize speed and attack. So for main pieces, we are looking at an attack percent body, speed boots, lightning damage percent sphere, and rope at attack percent. For relic stat goals for Kafka, your priority will be a 29% effect hit rate goal at E1 with stat investments into attack and speed. Your build does vary on effect hit rate from E1 up on account of her talent shop application, and you'll be required to have a 67% effect hit rate if that's something you want to aim for. There's also a lot of emphasis and conjecture about different speed breakpoints and which are the best, so I'm going to keep this very simple and avoid giving you a speed lecture. You will want a minimum 120 speed for a Planar Ornament Space Ceiling Station to proc. However, the first speed breakpoint that you'll want to aim for is 134 speed, which should be very achievable, and with some speed investment and speed boots can give an extra turn in the 1st, 4th and 7th cycle of the MOC, I think the 10th too. There are higher speed breakpoints, and each speed breakpoint brings with it different extra turn counts in the MOC, but you can reliably aim for the 134 to start before giving yourself a headache, and your Kafka will still be in a good place. Unless you can reliably hit the next speed breakpoint of 156 without her light cone, you are essentially wasting those stats, and you may find some value in slotting those pieces on some of your other team members, because the Luka, Sampo and Astas of the world will also want to be matching the same speed breakpoints as Kafka. I will link to a few resources below that cover additional speed values. If you do have Kafka at E1, there is some argument that you can swap the chest out for an effect hit rate body piece if you are really struggling to get effect hit rate rolls, but please be cautious that you are then trading a 43% attack piece, which would generally be better on her. At Eidolon 4, you can actually invest in an energy regeneration rope to ensure a 2-turn ultimate down from her regular 3-turn ultimate, but you do have to be careful because you're taking an attack loss, and it does require some heavy speed investment from a Meshing Cogs Asta to fully pull off, so it's completely up to you, and I say do so with your own calculations in mind. For substats, you will be happy with attack, break effect and crit as minor increments, but you won't benefit from them much overall, so your priority is in this case for your minimum effect hit rate and speed goals, and then attack percent on all the main pieces where you can get it. For relic sets, I'm going to start with a generic set and then cover the niche sets. For generic offering, you're going to want a 4-piece of Sizzling Thunder, as Kafka can benefit from both the 2-piece effect and the 4-piece effect for a DPS increase overall. If you are struggling to satisfy effect hit rate or speed breakpoints for your main stats or your sub roles, you can consider opting for a 2-piece combo starting with Band of Sizzling Thunder and then swapping in 2-piece of Musketeer or 2-piece of Traversing Hackerspade, so there is some flexibility in her generic loadout. There are also 2 niche builds that I've seen people being excited about and are viable. One option is the 4-piece Genius of Brilliant Stars for fighting against enemies with quantum weakness. You'll be maxing the damage ceiling in this case, and you will find more consistency potentially playing a defense shredder like Pela over a generic attack buffer like Asta. There's also potential for the 4-piece Eagle of Twilight lane set. I can only think of this being more viable when you're running a 2-turn ultimate Kafka, and it's a very niche recommendation, but it'd be bad not to mention that people are covering this as potentially viable. With regards to planetary ornament sets, my current recommendation is to hit Space Ceiling Station. At base build, you should be over the 120 speed requirement, giving you a free 24% increase into her attack. There is also an argument to be made that if you want to consider using a pan-galactic commercial enterprise set on Kafka, if you have her at Eidolon 1+ and are struggling to hit the effect hit rate thresholds. Aiming for the maximum attack percent passive on this through maximum AHR would prove to be an overall DPS loss, but you are looking at potentially just to use this set if you are struggling to hit effect hit rate benchmarks. With her kit covered and her build covered, let's move on to teams. Now, it's essential to cover that Kafka's teams are dependent on Kafka's ability to detonate the DoTs applied to enemies through her skill and her ultimate. As such, her best teams are going to be looking at those that can consistently apply damage over time effects, such as Sampo and Luka, so that she can get more value out of her skill and ultimate. Then, when you're thinking about support, it's worthwhile to consider that Kafka will benefit from attack and speed buffs through a character such as Asta, or she will greatly benefit from the enemy's defense being lower through characters like Pela and Silver Wolf. I have done a full guide on all 3 of these characters, which is another video which I'll link below, but it's just something to keep in mind when building out your team. For generic team comps, I'm going to start with something that I'm calling a free-to-play team because Kafka is on rate up with these 3 DoT characters on her banner, so you should have at least one. The team is essentially running Kafka and your DoT character, along with a shielder like March 7th, who at high investment and Eidolons can minor heal, cleanse, freeze enemies in place, and with Trend of the Universal Marketplace Light Cone, she can also actually apply a burn DoT on the enemy. Your flex slot is then up to you to properly manage. You can opt for another sort of sustain such as Natasha, or you can factor in another DoT applicator such as Luka or Sampo to increase your damage output, or you can consider an Asta if you have her at max Eidolons, well E4, because she can greatly improve the team's synergy for speed and attack. Moving into some further gadget territory, if you have a strong utility tank like Gepard, then people will be opting to play the triple DoT team and Gepard, mostly because in these scenarios, Gepard can tank enough to allow for multiple DoT applicators on the field. Having 3 applicators on the field gives Kafka more opportunity to detonate the applied DoT and clear through content. I will note though that someone like Fire MC and March 7th will struggle for self-sustain, so right now if you are considering the triple DoT comp, I do think Gepard is the only self-reliant option available. Now, I'm not going to go into a debate as to whether triple DoT or double DoT plus Asta is better than one or another. It's difficult because by sacrificing Luka as a DoT applicator, you will lose his damage mod buff in his ultimate and the incredible damage of bleed DoT, whereas sacrificing Sampo means you lose his DoT resistance in his ultimate and stacking capabilities of wind shear. However, these concerns can be offset because then when bringing Asta to the table, you're looking at bringing a 53 speed buff to your whole team for ultimate and a stacking attack damage buff that will again help the whole team. So it's completely up to you if you choose to play a triple DoT or double DoT with Asta to make that decision yourself. I do have a theory that some people also want to try solo Kafka, which will obviously be aligned to be a lightning weakness focused team. I'm not too sure how effective this will be off the top, but with max investment, I can see it making sense on the lines of carrying Kafka, bringing Tinyun, and then a defense breaker like Paler or lightning weakness imbuer like Silver Wolf plus some form of sustain. I mention this because I don't want people to feel that they have to use a 2+ DoT only team, but I will stress that solo DoT might struggle to hold up in a lot of content, so try at your own risk. And that's all I have for Kafka today. I hope I covered everything, which can be really hard to do sometimes with a new character like this, but let me know if you have any notes, and if you stuck around, thanks for checking me out. I'm Moth, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.